My friend and fellow author Blair Lynn remembers the moment the floor dropped out beneath her. What followed were panic attacks, ER visits, and waves of anxiety so intense they left her trembling, breathless, and afraid she might die. As a Christian, she knew she should cast her cares on God, but she didn't know how. In the depths of fear and discouragement, simple answers and spiritual cliches fell flat. There was no quick fix, no bypassing the valley. In Made to Tremble, Blair shares how she learned to walk with God through her anxiety, not around it. With scripture, story, and raw honesty, she shows what it means to embrace our weakness, not as failure, but as the place where God meets us most tenderly. This is a book for anyone who feels overwhelmed, afraid, or unsure if faith can hold in the storm. Through Blair's story, discover the peace of God and a deeper awe of the God of peace. Get your copy at madetotremble.com. What do you do when it feels like your spiritual life is crumbling? When trusted leaders fail, doubts rise, grief hits, and you don't know what to believe in anymore? In her new book, Someone to Believe In, embracing the Saviour who stays the same when everything else changes, author and Bible teacher Courtney Reisig helps us to see Jesus' unshakable character. If you're not sure whether you believe in Jesus yet, or if your faith feels unsteady in the face of grieving, burnout, or disillusionment, this book invites you to encounter Jesus as the one who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Get your copy of Someone to Believe In today at someonetobelievein.com. You guys are listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast. For better or for worse, this is how you're choosing to spend your time, or at least the next few seconds until you decide that you don't want to listen to my voice anymore. And fortunately, I've brought on a friend of mine who is going to have some interesting things to say, so you mostly won't be listening to my voice. Dan Strange is director of Crosslands Forum. He's vice president of the Southgate Fellowship and in theological leadership development of the London Project. He is a fellow of the Keller Centre for Cultural Apologetics, which is one of the ways in which Dan and I know each other. And he's the author of several books, including Their Rock Is Not Like Our Rock, Plugged In, and Making Faith Magnetic. Dan is a contributing editor to Themelios, an elder of Hope Community Church, Gateshead, United Kingdom. And he is married with 8 children. Dan, number one, I appreciate the fact that you are Doctor Strange.
Yes.
And that must lead to some interesting conversations where people sort of wonder if you have superpowers. So have you had any kind of fun encounters with Doctor Strange?
Yeah, well, great to be with you, Rebecca. Lovely to see you again. Yeah, I mean, there's some funny, there's obviously, the cashing in on the Marvel comics. So when I say that my name's Doctor Strange, I was speaking at a large liberal arts undergraduate, about 1,000 Americans last week in Tennessee, and they were whooping majorly when they found out I was Doctor Strange. And then when I say that my wife is also a doctor, and then my middle name is Stephen, which I know you, well, seeing as you had to kind of check with me beforehand that Doctor Strange was a Marvel character.
I'm totally ignorant, yeah, sorry.
Stephen is the middle name of Doctor Strange, so my middle name is Stephen.
Oh.
And then the kind of, if that is not enough, the biggest thing is to say that my dad chose the name Strange because he was from Guyana in South America and had a very Indian name. It would have been his great-great-grandparents would have been Indian workers brought up by the British to Guyana because it was a British colony. So when he came to the UK, he chose the name Strange. His name was Prashad. So that's the weird, the strangest thing about it all is that it was a name that my dad chose. We don't know why. It went to him to his grave.
Right.
But obviously it's caused some, not embarrassment, but it is a fairly strange thing to do.
Yeah, I mean...
Maybe it was because of the film Dr. Strangelove, the Peter Sellers movie. But anyway, so there you go. 4 or 5 fascinating facts about my name.
Yeah. Well, so here's one of the strangest things that you've done, or the things that are true about you. You have 8 children. Now, in many parts of the world and in much of human history, that actually wouldn't be strange at all.
No.
It's perfectly reasonable to have 8 children. In the 21st century West, it's sort of outside of people's mental reckoning.
Yes.
And when I went from having 2 children to having 3 children, a lot of people thought it must have been a mistake. It's probably, actually, wasn't. We were planning on having our third child. And where I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, if you have 3 children, that's quite a lot of children. If you have 4 children, wow, you're really doubling down on the children. And any number above that is sort of wildness in people's minds. So tell us why you and your wife have chosen to have 8 children and what that looks like.
It wasn't a kind of, I mean, it wasn't really it's not a big ideological thing. It's not like that. I got married when I was just 20. Elliot, my wife and I had grown up together in the same church. And then we got married when I was at the end of my first year as an undergrad. And so my kids are very spread out. So we've got kind of, my birth children are kind of 28 through to 11. And we just always loved having kids around, and we think they're a great blessing. And the big thing is that, never compare yourself to other people, because we know lots of people who think that we're completely crazy and mad. And it's all kinds of things, isn't it? It's about how much capacity you have, where I think God is leading us in terms of looking after family. And we just like being a part of a big family. I think we've also got into kind of fostering and adopting. So we fostered a little girl who we've now adopted, who's 3. And we're currently looking after another little boy who's 5. And as I said to you beforehand, it's very hard work. I mean, there's no kind of roses or sentimentality, but I do think it is an important it's an important thing to do. I think the stats are that if every church in the UK took responsibility for one foster child, it would kind of deal with the issue of the foster crisis that we have. But it's just how it's happened. But it is hard work, but we it's a great blessing, a real blessing. So three adult kids, 3 adult boys who live actually together in a house in a 2-bedroom flat actually in North London. And then the rest of us now live in the north of the country. And then, this little girl we've adopted, and then a little foster boy. Yeah. Yeah,
it's wonderful. It strikes me from talking with people and sort of looking at the statistics on these things that Christians choosing to foster and or adopt, often out of the kind of foster care system, it's a bit like Christian giving, i.e. if you're a regular churchgoer, you on average will give a far larger proportion of your money away than if you don't go to church. And that's true even if you just look at kind of non-religious charities. So it's not just that kind of Christians are giving to their local churches or whatever, they're actually also giving more to sort of non-religiously oriented charitable causes as well. But the Christians aren't giving half as much money away as they should be, like actually from a kind of Christian ethics perspective. Yeah. And sort of likewise, I mean, people will often make the claim, you Christians care about babies before they're born, but you don't care about babies and, as they grow up in foster care systems, etc. And that's actually also a sort of misrepresentation, because in fact, the likelihood of you fostering or adopting out of the foster care system, if you're a regular churchgoer, is substantially higher than if you're not.
Yeah.
But also probably not half as much as we should be as followers of Jesus. No. So I'm just sort of
and don't you? I mean, you've been in the States for a while now, but obviously you're a Brit. That within kind of I suppose what we'd call evangelical churches in the UK, in the States it seems much more of a common thing to do adopting and fostering than maybe it does in the UK. I mean, that's changed a little bit. I mean, a kind of a mutual acquaintance of ours, Krish Kandiah, he started this charity called Home for Good, which is great. And that's really promoted the importance of fostering and adopting in the UK. And I think that's had some traction. But I still think there's a lot more that can be done. And, if people are, I think I've become much more evangelistic towards it. And again, one of the key things is having the support networks around you, especially the local church. So we've really felt supported by our local church in all the ups and downs, of which there have been many. And, so I think it's something that I think people should seriously consider, but doing it as a kind of, not as a group project, because obviously, it's an individual or a couple who do it, but knowing that you've got support and you've got networks around you, I think that's absolutely crucial.
Yeah, and actually, I think that ties into a much a sort of broader question about how, if you are a follower of Jesus, if you are somebody who takes the Bible very, very seriously, what we even mean when we say the word family. Because I think there's a there's a sort of nominal sense in which a lot of Christians will say, oh yeah, I recognize that my local church is meant in some sense to be family. Like we might sort of throw that word around kind of a little bit, but probably if you press many of us sort of, put a gun to our head or whatever and ask us like to say, well, what is a Christian definition of family? Then we will default only to it's a husband and wife and however many, somewhere between 0 and 8 children or whatever it is. And because over recent decades in particular, there's been, a sense that Christians need to really defend this idea of family, the kind of husband and wife, biological children sort of picture of family against other possible formulations, that we've sort of been so busy defending that we've actually, I would say, ended up with a sub-biblical definition of family, because actually it's not just that, it's not just the nuclear family, it is the family of church. And so just as you as a foster parent need the support of your local church, so actually also you as a biological parent need the support of your local church. And, it's thinking about me and my 3 kids, my kids need the single adults of our church in their lives. They need the other parents, the grandparents, etc. Like we're actually, I think one of the most beautiful glimpses of what it means to be distinct as a follower of Jesus in our modern world is actually when we can kind of reach our hands a little bit around a more New Testament understanding of what the Christian family is. Yeah.
No, definitely. And also this kind of, this theological too, as a horticultural term, isn't it, of engrafting, as in something coming from the outside and becoming part of something that wasn't before. I think in terms of fostering, adoption, family, it's such a rich metaphor for what God has done for people who didn't know him, and now we're adopted into his family. And I think it's such a powerful testimony, both in terms of the church and then the fostering and adoption picture. And yeah, that comes in all kinds of different shapes and sizes. And that's to be celebrated, I think. Yeah,
absolutely. Dan, you wrote a book a couple of years ago called Magnetic Faith, which is a sort of funny title, a strange title. Let's call it that.
Yes, there you go.
Since we're on that theme. So tell us a little bit about the concept of that book and how it might help us to think about Christianity in the sort of modern Western context that you and I find ourselves in.
Yeah. So I think the book, it was all about how do we kind of get traction with where normal people are at, especially, I suppose, from a Christian point of view, who wants to tell people about Jesus Christ and, how wonderful he is and what he's done in my life. And just realizing that, your average post-Christian Westerner is just like in some ways living on a different planet in terms of, they're just living their lives. They don't think about these things. And I've been very influenced by a particular writer who was a missionary in Indonesia in the middle of the 20th century. And he was in the context of lots of different religions. And he said that the religions are kind of say very different things that we need to recognize. But there's certain kind of questions or certain, well, he calls them magnetic points. That's where we get the thing from. Certain itches that we have to scratch, that all human beings have to kind of ask these particular questions. And so my work's been looking at that framework and saying, yeah, that's not true for what we might call religious people, if you're a Muslim or Buddhist or animist or, whatever. But actually it's true of all human beings. They're these kinds of questions that everyone has to answer. They don't think about them, but their lives, the direction of their lives, the choices that we make, they're all ways of kind of scratching that itch. So that's what these magnetic points are. So in the book, Making Faith Magnetic, what I try to do is I try to describe the points and then give like contemporary examples of where we see this. And then the second half of the book is then showing how Jesus Christ both challenges or confronts the way in which we try to answer those questions, but how he also connects with them as well. So that's the kind of the basic idea of the book.
So give us some examples of those magnetic points.
Yeah. So there's 5, and these are kind of my ways of kind of understanding them. There's the magnetic point of, and again, they all kind of bleed into one another. So they're all perspectives on one person, but that you could lead with them, I suppose. There's this idea of totality. Is there a way to connect? We're looking for meaning and significance, And often we do feel quite insignificant as human beings. But when we connect with something bigger or someone bigger or some cause, we feel a sense of belonging, identity, connectedness. So we kind of flip-flop between feeling disconnected and then feeling connected. And so in the book, I give lots of examples of whether that's, going to a gig, watching a football team, tracing your family tree, engagement with social media, all of these ways in which we're looking for connection to feel that we're part of something bigger. And that there's that kind of itch that we have to scratch. Then there's norm. Is there a way to live? We all have codes of conduct, I suppose, rules in our cultures or our subcultures or our sub-subcultures, what makes us in or out, things that are kind of, that are often unwritten. And even noting that groups of people who go against the norm, the cultural norm, they still have their own rules. I remember in the book, we talk about a student of mine. She went through quite a goth phase in her youth, and she said that there were rules to being a goth. So you had to non-conform, but non-conform in a very conformist way. Apparently,
yes.
if you're an experienced goth, you can wear baby pink because it's ironic. But if you've just become a goth and you wear it, no. So even cultures that seek not to be countercultural are still quite predictable in their countercultural nature because they have their own rules.
I got to pause you there for a second to just reflect on something related. So growing up, as you and I did in the UK in a few decades ago, there's a sort of phenomenon thing that Christians do, which is make T-shirts that say Christian things, or various other apparel, but it's usually a T-shirt, right?
Yes.
And I would wear said T-shirts if there was a very specific reason to. We're having an outreach event at the university that I'm at. It's like a week long, and everybody's wearing the T-shirts to say, here's this event. And after that, I will literally never wear that thing again. Because there are a few things less cool than wearing a kind of cheesy Christian kitsch T-shirt. But what's fascinating to me right now is a number of young friends who sort of Gen Z or Gen Z as the Brits say it, who several of them have sort of become Christians relatively recently and are actually quite cool. And they are loving the Christian kitsch T-shirts and I'm thinking, oh, I will never be cool enough to wear a Christian kitsch T-shirt. Ironically, I'll just look like an idiot.
Yes.
I'll just look
yes, exactly.
And yet it seems to be a whole thing that people can do. And I'm I guess if you're sufficiently cool, then you can get away with wearing those kinds of things.
Yeah,
anyway, sorry,
exactly,
that was a complete
side
note.
Yes, the meta-modern irony, as they call, is very in at the moment. But of course, we're not from that generation. Well, I can only speak for myself, Rebecca.
No, I'm also not from that generation. I think you have the edge on me, but I'm also not from that generation.
So norms, and then there's deliverance. Is there a way out? So this is the perennial problem that we all think there's something wrong with the world. We all wish the world was better. The problem is we can't agree on what the problem is, let alone on what the solution is. So there's this idea of deliverance. And by deliverance, I don't just mean people thinking about death or existential questions, which of course all cultures do. It's even kind of mini deliverances, how do I get through the day without another drink? How do I get through the night without the baby crying? And also deliverance is not just about looking forward, it's looking back. It's that longing for, I wish it was like it was in the year, choose your year, whatever you think the golden age was. So that idea of deliverance, I think, is very, very strong. And we all have that feeling of, there's something wrong, but we can't agree on what the problem is, let alone the solution. And then there's destiny. This is my favorite. You shouldn't have favourite children, but this is my favourite magnetic point. Bavinck's got this great line where he says, we both lead our lives and we undergo our lives. I would say Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I feel that I'm in control. I'm the master of my own destiny. I've got agency. I can do stuff. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, I don't have any agency. I'm just the pawn in someone else's chess game. I'm a puppet on a string. There's no point in doing anything. And, you can see that in the history of philosophy between movements which have stressed kind of agency and those that have stressed fatalism. But even on the ground, we all kind of live with those situations. And I think that's a very interesting magnetic point. In the book, I talk a lot about superstition. But increasingly what's been interesting is talking to different cultural groups about how they see themselves. So, I mean, the biggest example for me is I did this kind of material in Slovakia in Central Europe with a group of pastors. And I said, do Slovakians think that you're in control or someone else's control? And we did a Slido poll. 99% of them said, Slovakians always think we're under someone else's control. You know, it was the Austro-Hungarians, then it was the Czechs. We're always the runt of the litter. There's no point in doing anything. We've got no agency. Now, I've done this material in the States. Can you imagine any American saying that? Of course not. It's about, you know, we can do anything we want to. It's kind of, you know, manifest destiny. We can, you know, we can change the world. So this destiny one's quite interesting. And it does affect the way that we view life. If you think that you've got no agency and you're just always a victim, or you think, no, we have the power. And Bavinck says that kind of individually we flip-flop between those things. But I think there's interesting cultural variance there. So they're the four magnetic points. And then I suppose there's a super...
I'm going to pause
you. Yeah,
you
sure. Stop.
Before you go on, because you have twice now mentioned Bavinck. Now,
yes.
Avid listeners to the Confronting Christianity podcast will have heard a previous conversation in which Bavinck was also referenced. But for those for whom Bavinck is not a household name, give us just a second on who you're talking about.
So for those of you who have know any kind of theology, so this is a guy called J.H. Bavinck. He had a very famous uncle who's much more famous called Herman Bavinck. I'm not talking about him. I'm talking about his nephew, and he lived from 1895 to 1964, and he was a Dutch missionary in Indonesia. So he's this guy that I've found really helpful, and what I'm trying to do is just update his kind of ideas for the 21st century. That's who he is.
Lovely. All right, carry on.
Yeah. So the final magnetic point. So we've got these four magnetic points: connection, norm, deliverance, destiny, and the final one is called higher power. I suppose it's not simply is there a God, but is there a reality beyond reality? And it's interesting, in Bavinck's time, everyone believes in a God. I mean, he's living in Indonesia in the 1930s. And of course, you know, you've got people, everyone believes. The question is, which God is the God that's going to give me connection or give me the norm or give me deliverance or my relationship in terms of control? I think in our secular post-Christian context, this is the magnetic point, though, that's like buried, that needs to be excavated. As we ask questions about connection and norms, where do they come from? How do we connect? How are we to be delivered? What is the relationship between me and any kind of force or power? We start asking deep, and that's where we dig up this question of not simply does God exist, but is there reality beyond reality?
Yeah.
And I think for us in my context in the UK, it's a kind of complicated because it does have a relationship with, I suppose, the influence that Christianity has had. So it's what you might call leads to kind of secular religious experiences. I mean, the example I give in the book is this phenomenon called champing, where people can pay to camp in a derelict church for the night. And so it's champing and camping, kind of portmanteau word. And there was a lady on one of the radio channels, TV channels, who wanted her children just to wake up with the experience of stained glass, of the light coming through the stained glass window, as if that would kind of wake us up a little bit. So the higher power is this idea of transcendence, really. And yes, I think it does eventually lead to what are we talking about or who are we talking about? But it's as we push into those magnetic points. So yeah, they're the five magnetic points, and they've all got a different kind of relationship, and they're culturally variable according to different cultures. But the point is, all human beings are asking these particular questions. And I've just found it a very helpful framework to understand people who don't call themselves religious or even spiritual, to see them with these eyes of the magnetic points saying, yeah, actually, when you start looking at the world like this, you see that we are trying to answer those questions of connection and norm and destiny and deliverance and a higher power. So that's why I found it a great interpretive tool, I suppose.
The Sing hymnal, from award-winning hymn writers Keith and Kristen Getty, is a rich collection of classic and contemporary hymns created to deepen worship, foster unity in the church, and proclaim the hope that we have in Christ. Alongside beloved hymns, you'll also find psalms paired with songs, liturgical readings, and helpful indices, making this hymnal a lasting resource for families and congregations alike. Pick up your copy wherever books are sold, or get 30% off at crossway.org/Getty hymnal with a free Crossway Plus account. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We talk about the sort of secular West, and we use that language, I think, both in the UK and in the US, where I'm now based. But to some extent, it's a myth, right? I mean, there are very few people actually living around me. Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I live, is one of the least churched parts of America. I think the Boston area is like the third least churched metropolitan area in America. So it's not, the Bible Belt. And yet the majority of people believe in some form of God. Like that they may well not be regular churchgoers. They may not have a sort of orthodox sort of Christian understanding of who God is, or a, Orthodox Muslim understanding or an Orthodox Jewish understanding. They may have more of a smorgasbord kind of view of God where you can pick the features that you want. But it's almost like we've sort of declared that the world we're living in, at least in our sort of microcosms, is dominated by a sort of a no to the idea of the supernatural, when actually, if anything, I feel like I'm seeing more and more people who are grasping at whatever kind of supernatural things they can get. Sometimes it's like crystals or tarot cards or meditation or whatever. Yeah. But it's seldom people who are saying, you know what, I've come to the considered belief that there is no God. It's usually sort of something much more mixed up.
A few things to say on that. I mean, there's the sociologists of religion always are arguing with each other as to are we more disenchanted to transcendence? Are we become kind of immune to transcendent experiences, or are we as enchanted as we've ever been? And I like to say that it's not that we're disenchanted, but we're differently enchanted than we have been. And one writer that I've really appreciated, and I know you've come across as well, is this lady called Tara Isabella Burton, who's written this great book called Strange Rites, where she looks in the American census at people who call themselves the nuns, not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S. Yeah. And her big take is actually, she says that, as you said, the minority of people would call themselves atheists or agnostics. She calls them religiously remixed. And, her book's great because what she tries to do is talk about all the, from Soul Cycle to wellness culture to kind of certain kinds of, I suppose, conspiracy theories, and then how capitalism kind of eats into that as well, or it uses that. But her big point at the end of the day is that there's a move from what she calls institutional religion to what she calls intuitional religion, but the intuitional religion is still looking for the same things that people have always looked for: community, meaning, rituals. Yeah. And I think, again, the magnetic points, I think, gives a kind of I suppose what I'm trying to do in my book is not just show that this is sociologically true, but this actually comes out, the Bible seems to describe human beings like this. So this sociology just confirms what's going on. But there's a lot going on. And I think increasingly, we're seeing this kind of rise of spirituality, the occult, things like manifesting are absolutely huge. And I think we just need to recognise that, and that seems to be the case. Now, of course, there are pockets where there's a sense you can still say that we're secular, but it's a very complex picture at the moment that's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I remember talking many years ago to a friend who was a professional scientist, in grad school, and didn't believe in God. And she, at one point, was telling me, the universe has a reason for what's happening to me right now. And I had to sort of press her and say, you actually don't believe, like, we've slightly got to pick a lane here. Like, either there is no God, in which case the universe does not have a plan. There is no, we're just atoms and molecules ultimately. And any sense of meaning or purpose or sort of intrinsic value that we have is pure delusion. Or there is a God, in which case we sort of need to be pretty serious about figuring out like who this God is. But we can't really fall between those two sort of poles, as it were, and say, the universe has a purpose for me. If we don't believe there is actually a God behind the universe, and yet I think that's sort of very much the wanting to grab at something that is that is spiritual. Because I think deep in our bones we know that there is something more. Like we know that we're not just mammals or just the sort of atoms and molecules that we're made up of, and we know love is real. We know that our lives mean something, and we should maybe listen to that. I mean,
I'm not a historian, but it is interesting to note, I think, in the history of ideas that magic and science have actually been quite close bedfellows traditionally. And there's a great book by a guy, I think it's by a guy called Josephson Storm, who's tried to show that some of the major kind of scientific discoveries, some of the people who instigated these major scientific discoveries were into all kinds of magical stuff or occultist stuff. And those two things have always been very close together, let alone that the founding of modern science, seems to be predicted upon articles of a Christian way of viewing the world in terms of what the world should be like. And I think that there's all kinds of things to discuss there in terms of the history of ideas and the history of science, especially.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that even the kinds of terms that we use today to describe non-religious thinking often turn out to be religious things. Like I was in the car the other day, my 14-year-old was asking me, Mum, what does humanism mean? And I said, well, it's a sort of funny word because it was actually first sort of invented by Christians, and now it signals somebody who doesn't believe in God and sort of centers everything around our humanness, but often, honestly, propagating a lot of very Christian beliefs about universal human equality and rights and care for the poor and all the sort of things that have, even by secular historians and philosophers, been shown to sort of come from Christianity. And then she said, I use the word secular to sort of, it's often paired like secular humanist. And I was like, but actually even the word secular is something that Christians came up with to describe a sort of distinction between people who are like sacred and secular, not the secular realm being something that's sort of beyond God's purview, but just setting up a sort of distinction between what's directly kind of spiritual and what's sort of somewhat outside of that straightforward zone. And there's so much today that we're even, we don't realize how Christian we are in our thinking often, even people who might never have been to church in their lives or have any understanding of the basic teachings of Christianity. We've sort of often imbibed a lot of that, at least if we're sort of in the West.
And also the converse of, and I think, there's been a lot of philosophers who aren't Christian at all, particularly, but who have wanted to try and show that science is not the pristine access to knowledge that we think it is. And, it's often governed by money, politics. It's a kind of, we kind of talk about, especially in the UK, when we were going through the COVID situation, about the science. But I think there's a lot of philosophy which has been quite helpful in trying to debunk the pristine knowledge that brings, and to say it's much more complicated behind the scenes as to what the science is. Yeah,
because even the kinds of questions that you're going to ask are going to depend. You're going to bring your ideological preconceptions to the questions that you're going to ask, even the kinds of experiments that you're going to run, the kinds of conclusions that you might draw. It was interesting. I was just reading this morning an article or a study on domestic violence or intimate partner violence, depending on how you look at it, for a book that I'm writing. And I've been looking at several studies that were showing that actually marriage is a protective device against domestic violence. Not for sure, not that people who are married can't experience that, but that actually you're substantially less likely to be physically abused by your sexual partner if you're married to them than if you're cohabiting or if in a sort of another arrangement. And then so I had that kind of in my mind from reading these other papers, and then I read a paper that was published, highly reputable kind of source. And in its discussion at the end, it was sort of talking about the relationship between domestic violence and various kind of configurations of living. And they said, probably a reason for the decline in this has been the decline in marriage, as in less marriage means less domestic violence. And I'm thinking, nothing in your study has shown that. In fact, there are multiple other studies that are pointing in completely opposite direction. But because that fits with your sort of ideological framework here, you're going to sort of throw that in at the end of a paper which hasn't shown that at all, sort of wild speculation on the basis of a preconceived idea, which is, and I think that's something, honestly, that all of us do. You and I will do that from a Christian perspective. People coming from a atheist or agnostic perspective will do the same thing, and that we kind of need to be somewhat aware of our own biases as we come into conversations.
And that's where I think late modernity or post-modernity has actually been a good ally or co-belligerent, I suppose, in terms of sometimes recognizing that the modern Enlightenment project, there's an understanding of faith and reason that it actually can be questioned, and we all have these commitments to things that we come in with, and that is very important that we recognize those, and then we try and compare and contrast them, and that's key to what I think we're trying to do.
Yeah. So Dan, you are a modern Westerner with multiple degrees, and you're married to a modern Westerner with a PhD. Why do you find this strange ancient religion called Christianity to be compelling in our modern world today? You've sort of pointed us to some of the questions that people are inevitably going to find themselves asking, regardless of how they identify religiously. But why do you find Jesus to be giving you sort of satisfying answers to those questions or points of connection to those magnetic spots?
Yeah. Well, I think on the magnetic point side, and again, this is kind of, I mean, I became a Christian, I was converted before I kind of came across these magnetic points. So from the magnetic point side, it would be that there's a way in which Jesus is able to scratch those itches in a way that I find satisfying, not just intellectually, but at a whole person level, in terms of Jesus is the point of connection. And that means a certain amount of confrontation because, you know, Christianity turns the world upside down. You know, people looking for identity, Jesus says to me or to you, you have to die to yourself. What? I'm going to die to myself. But yeah, but then you're born again and you have incredible significance. You can be who you were meant to be. Jesus gives us the norm. Jesus appeals to both moral conservatives and progressives at the same time. God's moral law doesn't change, but Jesus is against hypocrisy. He's for the marginalized. He's for the outsider. Jesus is the one who delivers us from the real problem that we have in terms of our relationship with God. Jesus is destiny, not in terms of being an impersonal force where you can get away with what you want to, but Jesus is a loving Heavenly Father. God is a loving Heavenly Father. So I think that's how the magnetic points kind of show how Jesus is able to both confront and connect with those points. I think for me, it does come down to, you know, who is this Jesus Christ? And, you know, there's a sense in which Christianity is a worldview. It's a philosophy. It's a social theory. I mean, I'm very happy to talk about it in all of those terms. But at the end of the day, it is about the person and work of Jesus Christ. And there's something about Jesus that I feel is compelling, and that there's a sense in which through God's Spirit, I've been able to know him personally, and that I want to introduce other people to him. And this idea of witnessing as being introducing a person to another person, and we're just an introduction agency really, and it is studying who Jesus Christ is, and that remains compelling. And I think sometimes when I struggle and I have doubts and I go, and then I do go back to, you know, at the end of the day, I can have all of these questions about what's going on, but I think, you know, is Jesus who he says he is? Did he rise from the dead? And those to me remain the kind of the some of the cornerstone ideas. And that's what walking with Jesus, knowing him personally, has been compelling to me since I became a Christian when I was 16.
Yeah. So tell us about that, Dan, because you mentioned that you'd become a Christian sort of prior to meeting your, well, maybe not prior to meeting your wife.
Yeah,
but certainly prior to marrying your wife.
I think it's interesting because my dad's family was Hindu, my grandparents. So I suppose my mum, we went to a local church, and I think I loved the church activities there and the sense of community. But I do just remember, and there was a normal service Sunday. I think our minister preached just quite a normal sermon, but everything kind of clicked into place, and I realised, yeah, Jesus is who he says he is, and I need to do something about this. So I remember having that kind of experience. I suppose intellectually, what's been interesting is then wanting to go and study theology, because I was always quite academic, but wanting to, because of my grandparents' backgrounds and having lots of questions about other religions, that kind of pushed me into that, the topic of the area that I was interested in, which was Christianity's relationship with other religions. And that's what I went to I went to a university that wasn't particularly favourable to Bible-believing Christians, but it was a great experience in terms of having to try and, you know, talk about my faith and justify where I was coming from, and then stay to do a PhD on those kinds of questions. So yeah, I think, but I mean, that, you know, those intellectual questions have always been alongside those has been that the importance of that personal faith and knowing who Jesus is and knowing that he is the Lord of the universe and wanting to tell other people about him. So that's how it's happened, really.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for joining me, Dr. Strange.
Not at all.
You guys have been listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast. You can follow us on X or Instagram. You can leave a review on iTunes and maybe there mention a topic you'd like to see explored in a future episode. And between now and next time I talk into your headphones, maybe you want to reflect on the things that in your life feel like magnetic points or questions or itches that you want to have scratched, and not just at a very basic physical level, but at the level of your entire life and your sense of who you are in this world and why your life might or might not matter. And maybe if you don't yet know Jesus personally, as Dan has mentioned, to consider whether Jesus might be the exact person that you're looking for, and whether you might find a relationship with him doesn't solve all of your problems, but gives you the connection and the meaning and the destiny and the deliverance that you and I desperately need.